What's up, guys? It's Dakota, and it's a beautiful Friday outside, and what a better way to spend your day than going to your local game store, or wherever you go to play Magic, and just staying in for hours and hours and hours, and just playing a ton of fun games, and having a good time with friends, family, mortal rivals, your neighbor, your dog. I don't know who you take to your game store. We're here to play, man. Like, today, it's Friday, and a special thing about like this Friday in particular is the first weekend that Guilds of Ravnica, or rather Ravnica Allegiance, is legal in Standard, and I felt like today was a good way to just kind of set some things to remember when you're building your new deck with all these sweet new cards we have from this new set. And as you can see on your screen, I have 4 things to keep in mind when you're tuning a deck, when you're thinking about what deck you want to play. And this is sort of if you've already kind of come to an idea of what you're going to play. Sometime next week I'm going to be posting a video going over a more like brewer's guide to deck building, but this one this week for the standard grinders, or for the people that want to just get into a sweet format and they've kind of already know what they're playing and they've been into it. This is sort of the video for you, but for those people that are more of the brewer type, playing with cards that they really want to play that may not be tier 1 or in a tier 1 deck, but have some way that they want to build around, things like that. That video is going to come next week, but this week we're going to be focusing on more of the tuning side of deck building. So I'm just going to dive right into it. The first thing that you want to keep in mind is, what is this deck trying to accomplish? So when you're playing an aggro deck, you obviously want the person dead. When you're playing a control deck, you want to make sure that you have the game pretty much locked up until you actually can win the game. If you're a combo deck, you're trying to assemble a few cards, whether it's 2, 3, 4, even 5 cards, trying to assemble some sort of combo to either win the game or make it very impossible for you to lose said game. And this is important when tuning a deck, because you obviously don't want to put control cards in your aggro deck. You don't want to put more combo-y cards in your aggressive deck, and you don't want to play super aggressive creatures in your control deck because they just don't mesh well and they don't go with the overall game plan. So when thinking about maybe putting cards into your deck, that's one main thing to consider is, does this help my game plan? Does this help me accomplish what the deck wants to accomplish? So as far as number 1 is concerned, really just keep in mind whatever cards you're thinking about playing. You want to acknowledge, all right, what kind of archetype am I playing? Does it help my game plan? Is it going to help me? Number 2, when you're picking up the deck, whether it's the first game or 1,000 games, play a ton of games just to make sure that you kind of understand the general play patterns of the deck. You don't want to just pick up a deck at the last minute and then take it to F&M or an event or whatever and get frustrated because you don't win the event. You lose games and everything, and you just don't learn anything that way. And it's a very weird way of testing said deck when you could have just decided even a few days ago, like, hey, I'm going to play this deck and get the basics of it down, and then maybe you'll learn the more complicated things as the day went on. Another thing that's kind of important on a number 2, and something that if you're going to test for more competitive events and you're going to be playing with a team, or you just have a group of people that playtest, playtesting in certain scenarios can help too. So I know for Modern, most people, including myself, it's kind of this thing that I've started where I want to make sure that like these cards that I'm playing in my sideboard or cards that I'm playing in my deck are good when they're good, and even when they seem like they're bad, they're still pretty good. So playtesting certain scenarios, maybe seeing how do I do against this matchup when I'm on the draw and I'm on a mulligan to 6? Or how good is turn 2 Stony Silence, per se, for the sake of Modern? Things like that. And it kind of is like a way to help build, like, well, should I mulligan more aggressively for these cards? Do these cards really have text in these matchups? What do these cards do? And that's an important thing when tuning a deck, because you want all 75 cards to do something. You want them to have their specific spots where they're good, more where they're bad. Maybe some main deck cards should be in the sideboard. Maybe there's some sideboard cards that should be in the main board. And this is kind of the thing that you want to keep in mind when you're testing for a format, is that doing these scenario tests can help out a lot in determining what cards should be in your main board, what cards should be in your sideboard, what cards should even be in the 75. So that's another thing that you want to keep in mind when you're tuning decks and generally when you pick up a deck as well. Number 3, maybe you decide that there is some cards that you don't want to be playing in your main deck or your sideboard and you think there's better ones. The main thing that you want to think of is the card or cards that you're considering fixing a problem that the deck has. So, kind of as I was just explaining, you don't want to put cards in your deck that don't do anything, and you don't want to put cards in your deck that essentially have to have you winning or have to have you in a good position, or that don't have text when you're losing to be in your deck, or at least to minimize the number of cards like that in your deck. So kind of the thing with like combo decks and where they can come up short is sometimes those cards like by themselves don't necessarily do a whole lot. So it's kind of like a restriction in its own right. But for like the aggro decks or the control decks, you don't want to have garbage cluttering up your main deck and your sideboard. You really want the cards that you're playing to do something. So when you're considering a card to replace any of those cards, you have to think of, well, has there been scenarios in these games where I'm like, I have card A over here, but I wish I had card B because that card would just be better in this situation, and kind of go from there. Any cards that say win you the game more, or cards that require you to be ahead, are other cards that you want to try to avoid and you want to try to identify, and that will come up in another video, probably sometime either next week or the following week. Just trying to stay away from the trap that is win more cards, that you're not playing them and getting trapped into this, well, when you're losing, this card is extremely bad, but when I'm winning, this card makes winning a lot easier, which isn't something that you want to go for. You just want to win the game. You don't want winning the game to be easier. And number 4, again, all these are super important. I keep saying, and I feel like I keep going down and saying that all these are super important, but definitely something to always keep in the back of your mind is that not every matchup is going to be a good matchup, even after sideboarding. So, and this is supposed to teach people that you shouldn't have 12, 13 sideboard cards dedicated to one matchup, because that matchup is just terrible, and because the other matchups that you might be playing are 50-50 to tipping towards your favor, that you can dedicate less cards to those matchups because they should just be free wins, or based on your skill alone, you can try to win those games. And that's kind of the thing where you have to determine, well, this matchup is really bad, I can put in 4 or 5 cards specifically for this matchup, but then have the other 8 to 10 slots be dedicated to just the other matchups and other cards that are just good in your deck when you want to take out the bad cards in certain control matchups, aggro matchups, whatever deck that you decide to play. And trying, while it's weird, talking about a sideboard's supposed to help you, basically make your matchups better. And that's like the key that you need to remember, is make your matchups better, not make your losing matchups into winning matchups, and make your winning matchups into just whatever because you're already winning. Decks have to adapt game to game, whether it's obviously game 1 you're stuck with a configuration, the 60 cards that you have, but then game 2 and 3, making sure that you have the 60 best cards in your deck possible to help you win the matchup. And again, while it's important, and yes, winning every matchup would be great, being able to say that this is a totally unwinnable matchup, but having enough cards on my sideboard to be able to make it winnable would be great. But if it ruins your percentages for your other matchups and makes your sideboard have to play super narrow cards that only come in those matchups, then that causes a problem, and that can make the skills in your opponent's favor, rather than you having a good matchup against 80% of the field and basically losing to that 20%, or at least having enough cards now to either level the playing field or make it so it's not as bad as what it was. And that's kind of the 4 things I'm going to say for more competitive players that are just looking at a deck list and thinking like, okay, I want to play this deck, and then after playing it, what do I want to add? What do I want to take away? What didn't feel good? What felt great? What cards do I want to play more of? What do I want to play less of? Things like that. And it's going to be kind of the same thing for the Brewers guide of it. Just now you're playing more specific cards tailored to a metagame and things like that, which we'll go into in another video sometime next week. But very important, and this is kind of like a double down on some other things, you know, because obviously Fridays, you know, people are getting ready for their big tournaments and stuff like that, whether it's an FNM or 5K, invitational, things like that. This is something important to remember when you're preparing for those events, and just in general, good ideas to keep in mind when getting ready for new standard events. And yeah, that's really it. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you guys learned a lot, or at least a little bit from this. I'm trying to do the best I can to help the players that are going to be going to these events, and just trying to get out of the traps that some of the sort of newer players make, or maybe not so experienced players end up making when deciding what cards they want to play in their deck, what cards they want to take out, and things like that. Really having a critical view of all the cards that you're playing, and basically saying that no card is safe, but at the same time conceding the fact that just because you want to add a card to a deck doesn't mean that you should just rush in and do it right away. Definitely make sure you do your testing. Definitely make sure that you do your research as well. Maybe kind of get some other data, and obviously confer with other players, and really just kind of dive into it and make it a mission to actually improve the deck, and not make it a deck that you just want to play these cards in it because you think that they will be good. And that's going to be it for me. Hope you guys have a happy Friday. Enjoy FNM, Standard, Modern, whatever the heck you guys are playing this week. Let me know in the comments what deck you're going to be playing today, or just in general for FNM, whatever you have fun playing with, whatever your baby is. Heck, it could even be Pauper, I don't care. But yeah, that's going to be it for me. Check back Monday for Sweet New Deck Tech. I'm going to be going over one of the sweet new decks in Standard, which is going to be a huge surprise, a deck that I think is going to be pretty good moving forward, and a deck that's going to look like a lot of fun for, I'll even say, like the aggro players that had fun playing those aggressive decks in this past Standard with Guilds of Ravnica. But yeah, that's going to be it for me. I will see you guys in the next video, and I hope you guys have an awesome Friday.